In the spring of 1852, when the river finally receded and exposed what had been hidden beneath the mud for nearly a decade, the first thing the fishermen noticed was not the bones, but the rope. It was still knotted, still intact, looped carefully around a rusted iron ring driven deep into the limestone bank. The skeleton attached to it was incomplete, missing its hands and most of its lower jaw, but the posture suggested intention. Whoever had tied the rope had not been improvising. They had known exactly where the water would rise and how long it would stay. The land belonged to the Halvorsen estate, a plantation just far enough from the main roads of coastal South Carolina that travelers rarely passed it by accident. For years, locals had referred to it as quiet land, not peaceful. Quiet, the kind of place where sound seemed to sink into the ground before it could travel. The Halvorsens were not an old Southern family, nor were they particularly wealthy. What they were known for was order. Their fences were straight, their crops evenly spaced, their slaves silent to a degree that unsettled neighboring overseers. No songs drifted from the fields, no arguments carried on the wind. Even the dogs rarely barked. August Halvorsen had purchased the plantation in 1839, arriving with his wife Eleanor and a single wagon of belongings. They brought no extended family, no stories, no history anyone could verify. He paid in gold, never negotiated, and immediately began expanding the slave quarters, not outward, but downward. Trenches were dug, stone was hauled, rooms were built beneath the earth and sealed with wooden floors that matched the rest of the structures above them so closely that even experienced builders could not distinguish one plank from another. At first, neighboring plantations assumed Halvorsen was building storage. Then they assumed he was hiding wealth. No one guessed the truth, because no one wanted to imagine a reason for what followed. Within 2 years, slaves began disappearing from nearby estates, not runaways. Bodies were never found. The numbers were small enough at first to be dismissed as coincidence, but patterns emerged. Always young, always healthy, always gone without sound or struggle. Owners complained. Patrols searched. Notices were posted, and still nothing was discovered. The Halvorsen plantation ledger showed perfect consistency. Births were recorded. Deaths were listed as illness or injury. The total number never changed, yet men working the river swore they saw unfamiliar faces in the fields at dawn, faces that vanished by noon. Slaves from other plantations refused to step onto Halvorsen land, claiming the soil felt wrong beneath their feet, as though it shifted when no one was looking. One woman, brought there temporarily to help with harvest, returned shaking and mute. She died 3 weeks later without ever explaining what she had seen. Eleanor Halvorsen was said to be ill, always ill. She never attended church, never hosted guests, and was never seen beyond the second-floor windows of the main house. Curtains remained drawn even in daylight. A doctor from Charleston was summoned once, then never again. He left the property pale and sweating, refusing payment and declining to speak of what he had been asked to examine. Within a year, his practice closed, and he moved north without explanation. Children born on the plantation were not celebrated. They were recorded, measured, and removed from their mothers within days. Some women were told the infants had died. Others were told nothing at all. At night, soft sounds traveled through the ground. Rhythmic, repetitive, almost mechanical. Those who slept above the underground rooms learned to breathe quietly, afraid that even the sound of air moving through their lungs might be noticed. In 1846, a storm unlike any in recent memory struck the coast. Rain fell for days without pause, flooding the riverbanks and collapsing parts of the Halvorsen fields. When the waters receded, several sealed rooms were exposed. August Halvorsen ordered them reburied immediately, using slaves from neighboring estates hired for the task. None of those men returned home. Halvorsen claimed they had been paid and sent on. No one ever saw them again. Suspicion grew, but proof did not. The Halvorsens were careful. They invited inspectors during daylight, guided them along safe paths, and spoke calmly of agricultural innovation and spiritual discipline. August Halvorsen was a man who never raised his voice, never struck a slave in public, and never drank. His cruelty, if it existed, left no visible marks. That was what made him difficult to accuse. Everything ended on a Sunday morning. Church bells were ringing in the distance when smoke rose from the Halvorsen property. Not from the house, but from the ground itself. Neighbors arrived to find sections of the field collapsed inward, revealing staircases leading down into darkness. August Halvorsen stood nearby, unmoving, watching as flames climbed from below as though the earth itself were burning. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. When men descended into the exposed chambers, they found long stone corridors lined with iron rings set into the walls at regular intervals. The floor was scored with drag marks. Tables stood arranged in rows, each one marked with numbers carved into the stone beside it. Tools lay neatly organized. Saws, clamps, calipers, needles, no blood, no bodies. Only the smell of smoke and something older, something that had seeped into the stone over years of use. In the deepest chamber, they found Eleanor Halvorsen. What remained of her was not easily described. Her body bore signs of repeated alteration, bones reinforced with metal, joints reshaped, organs removed and replaced. She was still alive when they found her, breathing shallowly, eyes open but unseeing. A slate hung beside her, covered in measurements updated daily in August Halvorsen's handwriting. Height, weight, bone density, reaction time, notes referenced, subjects, failures, and absorption. August Halvorsen was arrested without resistance. During questioning, he spoke freely, almost eagerly. He explained that his wife suffered from a condition that caused her body to deteriorate rapidly. No treatment had helped, so he had begun to study replacement. Not organs, not blood, people. He claimed that proximity mattered, that strength could be transferred, that youth slowed decay, that fear accelerated it. The underground rooms were not prisons, he said. They were instruments. Before he could be formally charged, August Halvorsen died in his cell. The official cause was listed as stroke. No autopsy was performed. Eleanor Halvorsen died 2 days later. Her body was buried at sea by order of the church. The underground chambers were sealed with stone and soil. The land was declared condemned. Years later, fishermen still avoid the river bend near the old estate. They say the water there is warmer, even in winter. They say ropes surface after storms, still knotted, still attached to nothing, and sometimes when the river is low and the mud cracks open, they swear they can hear counting beneath the ground. Slow, careful counting, as though someone is still measuring what remains. In the spring of 1846, the road leading to Belhaven Plantation was avoided not because it was guarded, but because it felt watched. Travelers spoke of an unease that crept in long before the house came into view, a pressure in the chest that made horses slow and voices fall quiet. Belhaven lay in low-country Georgia, surrounded by fields that should have been noisy with labor, yet always seemed strangely subdued. Its owner, Horace Belhaven, was regarded as a man of refinement, educated, soft-spoken, deeply interested in anatomy and natural order. He hosted dinners for clergy and officials, spoke eloquently about God's design, and never once raised his hand in public anger. What no one could explain was why his plantation records were constantly being revised, numbers scratched out and replaced, as if the people living there were never fixed long enough to be counted. The first rumors came from neighboring farms. Slaves hired out to Belhaven would sometimes return thinner, quieter, and unwilling to speak of what they had seen. They claimed the work itself was ordinary, but the nights were not. Bells rang after dark, slow, deliberate chimes that marked something other than time. Windows in the main house glowed late into the night, and shadows moved inside long after everyone else slept. Women taken into the house for special duties were rarely seen again in the fields, yet no graves were ever dug. When asked, Horace Belhaven would smile and say they had been sold south, though no bills of sale were ever produced. Belhaven's wife, Eleanor, had not been seen in public for years. Officially, she was ill and confined to her rooms. Unofficially, townspeople whispered that she no longer recognized herself in mirrors. The Belhavens had lost several children in infancy, and those losses were spoken of with pity during church sermons. Horace himself once said, with a calm that unsettled the listener, that God sometimes took children away because they were unfinished. After that remark, the pastor changed the subject, and no one ever asked Horace Belhaven to elaborate again. The plantation's overseer, a man named Caleb Moore, lasted only 6 months. When he left, he refused his final wages and departed at night without farewell. Years later, when questioned by a circuit judge, Moore admitted that Belhaven kept detailed journals, not about crops or finances, but about bodies, measurements, symmetry. He claimed Horace believed that proximity could change people, that certain bodies altered when kept together long enough. Moore said he once saw a room beneath the house where chalk lines covered the walls from floor to ceiling, each line paired with dates and small symbols he could not read. When he asked what they meant, Horace simply replied, "Progress." In 1847, a midwife named Clara Hensley was summoned to Belhaven. She was told a slave woman was in labor and complications were expected. Clara later testified that the child was born alive, breathing, but wrong in ways she could not describe without trembling. The mother was taken away immediately, and the infant was carried downstairs instead of to a cradle. When Clara demanded to know where they were going, Horace Belhaven thanked her for her service and pressed a heavy purse into her hands. She never returned to the plantation, and for the rest of her life she refused to assist in any birth that took place near Belhaven land. The fire came 3 years later, during a stormless night. It began underground. Neighbors saw smoke rising not from the roof, but from the earth itself, as though the soil were burning. When they arrived, Horace Belhaven was already outside, standing barefoot in the grass, watching the house collapse inward. Eleanor was found wandering the yard, muttering numbers under her breath. When authorities searched the ruins, they uncovered stairways leading below the foundation into rooms that should not have existed. There were tables bolted to the floor, iron restraints polished from use, shelves of jars containing fragments no one could identify. The chalk markings covered every surface, hundreds of them, thousands. There were no bodies, not in the cellar, not in the fields, not buried anywhere on the property. Plantation records were seized and later declared incomplete. Eleanor Belhaven was committed to a private asylum, where she died within a year, still counting. Horace Belhaven vanished during the confusion, leaving behind only his journals. Most were burned by order of the church, but one survived. In it, he wrote that separation ruined the work, that distance weakened what closeness strengthened, and that he had finally understood why God gathered people together in families, plantations, and congregations, not for mercy, but for transformation. Today, Belhaven Plantation no longer appears on official maps. Farmers who tried to work the land reported finding stone beneath the soil, smooth walls, sealed doors, empty rooms that echoed when struck. Animals refused to graze there. At night, some claimed to hear bells, slow and deliberate, ringing from beneath the ground. The records say the Belhavens were ruined by fire and misfortune. The locals say the counting never stopped.